Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is the season review 2023. Today we will be stopping at Haas, Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri, and Williams. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your guest conductors today are LawVS and the mobile Chicane. Welcome back, guys.
Hello, hi.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure, never a chore.
So, 2023 at long last, after 22 or what could have been 24 grueling races, has done and dusted. Been time to things to settle down and start to reflect on it. And so we thought we would cover each team individually. And so we're going to start at the bottom and go up. So first of all, I think we should cover Haas. From my perspective, quite a very disappointing season where they didn't really do much. They did their classic thing essentially of a few occasional good qualifying performances and then just disappearing in the races, but without any of the big crashes or interesting sponsor scandals that they usually provide us with for entertainment.
Yeah, it seemed relatively tame for Haas. Like, no real dramaettes, quite frankly, because you just got Haas turning up, as indeed the slide shows, because we're usually finding some kind of controversy. I mean, 2022 was relatively tame. Same again. Have they finally matured, Haas? Well, not quite, because even though they managed to score a decent amount of points last year, they scored about 37, I think. They have now fallen down to 12, and they can probably thank the likes of Daniel Ricciardo for being last, quite frankly, after his 6th place in Mexico. And that was just crazy seeing all that. And of course, they had another DNF, which they've had at least 7 of them. Probably right up there with the likes of Alpine in terms of DNF. So Haas, the issue they seem to have is that they don't really seem to know how to fix the problem. I know that with their collaboration with Ferrari, with Simone Aresta being their technical director, mainly off the back of the fact that thanks to the cost cap, Ferrari needed to kind of just push some people away to bring costs down and go like, hey, Haas, only with an Italian accent, can you take these people? Yeah, that'd be great, thanks. Because they've got their own little bolt hole office in Maranello, I think, or in Italy at the very least. But I don't think we've really seen any of that kicking on with them doing their own in-house development. But I'm just starting to see a pattern here with Haas that we are starting to see a phenomena where one car is favored over the other. There is clear favoritism, I think, because we saw that in 2021 with Mick Schumacher being favored over the egg by sometimes nearly a whole minute in terms of pace in a race. I'm not saying that a minute behind the leader, I'm saying a minute behind the other Haas sometimes. I think in Baku especially. Then 2022, we saw K-Mag coming back with his Viking performance and him being favored over Mick, having more developments. And then by the time Mick was actually starting to learn the tricks of the trade and how to deal with the Haas wasn't developing, and then they fell down, so he couldn't really score any points to redeem himself. And now we're seeing the same thing with K-Mag being outshone by Nico, because Nico has been pumping in the results, getting more Q3 appearances. The overall package seems to suit Hulkenberg better, and I just feel like Hulkenberg's just had more of a sway, because I've rarely seen a driver just going, I don't like that spec of car, I want the old one. And Haas just go, okay, we spent our entire year on this Austin upgrade. We worked really, really hard on this. Okay, we'll just go with the old one. And then I think in the those couple of races, Magnussen did better in the race, which was really ironic. But you could just tell that the team doesn't really know how to figure things out. It just seems to be same old.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're talking about sort of that direction of the team, how they may favour kind of one car over the other, and you can see that sort of with those performance levels, especially across those last 3 years. Something like that was, very commonplace in F1 for a long time, particularly sort of in the late 90s as well. Teams couldn't really afford to run 2 cars at the same kind of specs. You would have one where all the upgrades, all the focus would be on that, and they'd have the more experienced or sort of lead driver within there, and then the other, someone more to bankroll the team and sort of keep things floating along, but very little attention would be paid to that car, and all sort of the main focus would be on the other as well. That was something that the likes of your Saubers, your Arrows, stuff like that. They would do all that. So it would be interesting if Haas are maybe approaching that effort because it was more indicative of kind of a money thing for doing that. You don't really hear too much about. Again, it's been such a drama-free year. We've not heard too much about sponsors or money or anything like that. So
Mm.
I don't know how well Haas are doing on that front particularly. I don't know if you guys have seen or heard anything relating to that.
Well, there were rumors concerning because Alfa Romeo have now split from the sport entirely, but there were rumors saying that they were going to be partnering up with Haas, but they said that they were working with another team, but the expectations weren't met. So I imagine probably they were asking for too much money. But I don't really think that Haas has got a money problem anymore because the cost cap's now down to 135 million, and I believe Gunther was joking earlier in the year saying we finally have a full budget. We actually have reached the cost cap threshold for the first time. So they have the cash, and they just don't have the infrastructure or the independence yet to be able to develop their own parts. They're working on it. I believe they are, and they're not relying on Dallara so much because Dallara makes the bodywork for them and makes the base chassis, and that's something that they've been doing. I think that was one of their shticks at the beginning, that they were relying on customer parts as much as possible. But they're now starting to develop more of their own stuff now that the now money is no longer as much of an issue because that was a thing. And the MoneyGram sponsorship, that's like, okay, it's a somewhat legitimate brand, and you feel like, no, I've heard of MoneyGram before, like before with Your Alkali and Rich Energy. I've not really heard of those ones, and yeah, so I just feel like, okay, they're starting to get their act together in terms of where they get their money from. It's just a case of how are they going to implement that money the most effectively.
I think at best you could call them an Italian-American team at this point because they're trying to market themselves, oh yeah, we're this American team, but then it's like, oh yeah, the car's built in Italy and the team principal's Italian, none of our drivers are American, most of the staff are British, the engines are Ferrari engines, the suspensions and gearbox are all from Ferrari as well. It's like, yeah, that really reads as American to me. Yeah, it is interesting that everything is still built by Dallara, but they have they've always had decent-ish money, I guess, because the parent company is Haas Automation, which is kind of where it got built out of, and the same with Gene Haas's NASCAR team as well. There was some a little bit of controversy last year that rumors that Haas Automation was still sending parts to Russia after the invasion happened. I was like, okay, this could be their next thing after Rich Energy and the Mazepins and all of that, but that didn't go anywhere. So I'm assuming they're not doing too badly for money, aside from the fact that last year, obviously, Gunter was not coy about the fact that Schumacher crashing all the time was costing them a lot of money. So that probably has created a dent. But it is interesting the way that they're putting upgrades on the car and then they're like, oh, actually, the old one feels better. That seems to be a recurring theme because this happened with Aston Martin. And then we had this 2018 with Ferrari. It took them 5 or 6 races to realize their upgrade package was actually worse and then take it off. And by that point, they'd lost the championship. So we are in this interesting phase now where originally upgrades used to work. And maybe it's because now the development cap is so high and because the rules are so strict, you can't change much, that when you do change things, it often makes things worse. Because an upgrade is meant to make things better, but a lot of the times people are like, I prefer the old car.
Yeah, it feels like what's becoming more important in this era of Formula One is correlation between the wind tunnel and reality. That's why you saw more of this year people testing 2024 spec parts and not having to run it on the main car, because I believe there is a loophole where you can run 2024 spec parts and not tell anybody. Well, you don't have to do a show and tell. So long as you tell the FIA that, hey, don't worry about this. We're not going to race with these parts. We're just testing them. Yeah, I believe, because I think Red Bull did that with some parts in FP1 of Abu Dhabi, with the 2 junior drivers. Because that was interesting. Because I kept hearing on the radio, and this could be something that Haas is considering. This is in relation to Haas. This is something I think they really need to work on and invest in. Is their wind tunnel time, or to at least figure out the disparity between what they get in the simulator and CFD and what they get on the track. because that could waste a lot of time and resources. Because what you put on the car now, and this is something the big teams really need to consider as well, it has to be of worth. And I just don't think Haas really have the capacity to do steady upgrades and trickle them. That's kind of like how McLaren was able to work it, because they trickled the upgrades throughout the entire season, and each of them worked, like, almost instantly. So Haas, they did their one upgrade. I think they did a similar strategy last year, because I think they had their big package in Hungary. And it kind of worked for a while, but then they didn't bring anything else. So I think they just need to get a somewhat good baseline and just bring in steady upgrades with what they can do. But hopefully, since they're now able to do more independent development, that might yield something. And also, they've got a fire under their bums because Nico has actually started to become more vocal, as in, like, this isn't good enough. You need to change how you do things, or else we're not going to get anywhere. And that is a clear thumping of the drum, because there were rumors going around, and especially in relation to the team we're going to be talking about next, is that the reason why the Alpha, well, Sauber, or Stake F1 team, or whatever you want to call it, don't have Nico is because the 1+1, that's what is the contract that Nico has. Gunther took up the option for Hulkenberg to stay, and Sauber, I think, wanted Nico to get him ready for, I believe, 2026 or even 2025. So Nico's still hot property in terms of the back teams, especially. A consistent, solid qualifier who, if you give him a good qualifying position and a car that can do a good race distance, can get you points. And at the back, that's vital. And I think Haas could make good use of that if they had their tyre problem sorted. That's been there since 2019.
Yeah, I think one thing that's probably worth touching on with particularly this season as well, we're calling this sort of the backmarker episode, and we describe Haas as just kind of showing up as well. I mean, in a way, F1 doesn't particularly really have backmarkers anymore. When we were growing up, it was very much a place reserved for when we had those three new teams in 2010, or you had your Minardis or a Jordan or something like that. The gap has kind of moved down so much. There was never a default, this person is going to qualify in the last two places and then run around at the back all race as well. It kind of admittedly, it did kind of juggle between these four, perhaps more than any others. But there was very rarely a case where it was just the two consistently stuck at the back, both in qualifying and in the race itself. The gap it's easy to miss given sort of how dominant the Red Bulls were at the front, but the gap between everyone else has really kind of condensed a lot. I saw a tweet this morning where they showed the gap within Q2 at the Japanese Grand Prix between this year and 2015. And the gap from first to last within that Q2 session was about 7/10. And if you put that into 2015, that qualifies you as high as fourth. Someone's got to finish last at the end of it. That's just the way the sport works. And inevitably, that person is the worst person. And Haas, of all the people, did the worst job. But they weren't a million miles away that we've seen other people who finished last in the past do as well. I know points tallies have changed, and we've got the sprint races now and all this sort of stuff as well. I think 12 points is the most someone who's finished last has ever scored in the championship. So again, it shows that's kind of bunched out a lot more. And like you said, Law, without Ricciardo's kind of miracle drive in Mexico, we'd have a different kind of story to tell here as well.
Yeah, 2009, using the modern point system, Toro Rosso, I think, scored 28. So off the top of my head, I think that's the least someone scored from last place if you convert it to modern points. No,
again,
most. It was the most from last place, wasn't it? Yeah, so that is them. 28, yeah.
Yeah, but again, that was another really kind of competitive year. It kind of shows, the contraction of the grid at that point. And at that point, it was a real kind of roll of the dice as who would be finishing in the points that year, and everyone had good and bad races. You could kind of argue the same with this year as well. I mean, Haas almost scored a podium this year. Admittedly, it was within all the kind of the shenanigans at the end of Australia. But again, just for a slight twist of fate or kind of the flap of a butterfly's wings, we could be singing a lot more praises about Haas this year.
You are very right. Convergence is going to become more of a factor, especially since now there were rumors in 2025 they were going to do some minor tweaks, akin to what they did in 2021. about dealing with the outwash problem, like changing front wing end plates and the tweaks around the floor edge. They're not doing that anymore. That's going to be bundled in the 2026 regs. So we're going to have now 2 seasons of exactly the same specs, like no bit major rule changes. So I believe by the time we get to 2025, we could, as you say, get consistently in qualifying less than 7/10 on the regular. As in, you make one mistake and you are last.
Yeah, I mean the convergence is very interesting because it is getting stronger and stronger, and it's because the technical regulations are limiting things more and more that it's just getting so close to a spec series. I pointed this out with a tweet that blew up. It was just a shot of the cars, the start of one of the races in 1992, all going through a chicane, and I was like, okay, all of them, they look completely different, like very different chassis. Like the nose is complete. You got raised ones, dropped ones, really weird front wing like support struts and all of that stuff going on. But then also there were all these very bright, bold colors, very distinctive liveries. Whereas now the cars, all aside for the side pods, they all look basically the same sort of duck build type nose thing and very flat wings. And because they're trying to save weight on paint, most of them don't even have that much paint on them as livery. So lots of very dark, very black and navy blue. They just don't. So even physically, they don't stand out, and as well as just how they perform on track is so narrow. And I think that's going to be the case again next year because we're not seeing much in the way of technical changes. So we're basically just going to pick up where we left off, and everyone is slowly going to try and turn their car into a Red Bull without copying them directly, I guess.
Yeah, I think everyone's settled the fact that the Red Bull concept is the best one, and now it's a case of who's going to do it, who's going to make that package work the best, and whether or not they can maybe try and find some innovations along the way that Red Bull and Adrian Newey didn't think about. And of course, we could always have Adrian Newey with the RB20 pull a clanger. He did make the MP418 and the RB16, and they weren't great at the beginning. I remember being at the 2020 test at Barcelona, and Max just kept spinning all of the time, as well as Alex. They both kept spinning throughout the entire testing, just because it was so skittish. They fixed it, of course, because Red Bull, they were able to fix the problem. But initially, that car was extremely sensitive, and the MP418 didn't even race. So Adrian Newey, he's very lauded, but sometimes, might not make the best car initially. So it's a case of whether Red Bull carry on and just evolve the RB19, which should surely be the most likely option, or try and do something completely new and demoralize people even more. But I think Haas just at the moment just need to, their main priority now is just have a steady upgrade path.
Yeah, they need to kind of drag it back to, what was it, the 2017 kind of 28 performance level, when they were kind of that consistent best of the rest within the pack. That's kind of the best Haas has ever been. And since then, they've never really been able to find, I don't know what kind of magic juju they, brought about to make that kind of season happen, but it's increasingly kind of looking flash in the pan rather than a kind of indicative of what we can expect from them again in the future. They've sort of been mired towards this kind of rear of the train for such a long time now. And you wonder what maybe they need to kind of give them that impetus. I know, we said that, yeah, they need to work out their upgrade packages. They need to make sure that they can move that forward as well. Do they need to kind of confer maybe a little bit closer with Ferrari in a way? And you don't want to lose your identity as a team just for the sake of being the B team that, some other people can that trap that kind of other people can fall into as well. But if it's going to provide you better parts, better access to facilities, even sort of access to drivers as well, that again, saving a bit of money from that perspective of not paying out all these salaries, is that something that Haas need to maybe look into just to kind of help push them up the grids? Or do they just kind of say, no, this is our identity, we're keeping where we are, but then almost consigning themselves towards this kind of rear pile that they're at?
I don't really see them suddenly jumping up the grid, but in 2022, they proved that what they did in 2021 worked, because they had the 5th fastest car immediately, And if they developed it properly throughout the entire season and had that upgrade path, they probably would have been in with a shout of worrying the likes of McLaren, and probably might have even been in contesting 5th place in the constructors and pushing McLaren to 6th. And that would have just made the whole situation with Daniel Ricciardo even worse. But it's just a case of they had the upgrades, and clearly it was the most developed car in 2022 out of the new regulations because they'd obviously studied it the most. But they just didn't know where to go from there. They couldn't quickly adapt. And thusly, they fell right back down again to finish 8th. And this year, they were just... I think Gunther's actually come out and said that, yeah, we tried some things out in the simulator, it didn't work, and we didn't act quick enough to respond to it. So that's the thing. They need to react faster.
Yeah, there isn't much inbuilt, I think, in terms of them having this intuitive knowledge of what direction to go and everything. Because I think in terms of the 2018 was, they're by far their strongest year. I think the key to their success that year was the fact that they were using Ferrari's 2017 car, give or take. Like, people complain it looks a lot like it, and it did look a lot like it. It's like, when you think, well, they've already got the engine, gearbox, and suspension. So it's not much of a stretch to say that maybe the rest of the car is basically the same as the car that almost won the championship. But otherwise, because there's so much outside assistance, it's kind of, in one sense, it's not surprising that they don't seem to know how to develop and upgrade things themselves. Because as well as last year, the lack of development, they weren't helped by Mick crashing all the time. And that denied them a lot of... There were very few races where both cars were strong, and that, again, is always going to have an effect. In 21, that would have made no difference, because even at strong races, they were still nowhere near points. And this year, it just was very rarely that close between Hülkenberg and Magnussen. Most notably in qualifying, there was a gap, but I don't remember many races where they were just like running in formation or whatever. But they're just becoming boring, and you're sort of looking at them thinking they don't have much in terms of distinct identity or sort of outlook as a team. And maybe if they could have that, if they were leaning on the all-American image, but they're just because we're used to them being the joke comedy team, they're just becoming boring. And it's like there's not much point being here if you're just going to run around in 13th and 14th.
Yeah, and I think another team that really has to be given that kind of idea about really bucking their ideas up and changing their brand are the likes of Sauber, or should I say, to quote their actual entry name from the FIA entry list for 2024, the Stake F1 team Kick Sauber. What on earth is that name? You know what? This is all because of the team representative. It's not the team principal, it's the team representative, whose names I cannot remember, and I cannot be bothered to remember, because he's just there for Andrea Stella's sake, is that this was going to be a surprise. And I was thinking, oh, a surprise, eh? Have Sauber managed to wangle another Mercedes sponsor back, the likes of Petronas, perhaps, back to a nostalgic term, or maybe the likes of Tissot, the Swiss watchmaker, their first major sponsor back in the mid-90s? No. Turns out that basically, I think the likes of Stake and Kick are aware that Audi is not going to be partnering with them, because I don't think Audi would want to be associated with gambling and crypto gambling. So they're probably just going, you know what, we'll just add some extra money to the pot and just buy the naming rights out entirely. Because before, it was Alfa Romeo F1 team Stake. Now it's the Stake F1 team. The Sauber thing's an afterthought, and I'm thinking, wow, this team has been around since the early 90s, been one of those dark horses, and now suddenly their name is an afterthought. Great, thanks. The only redeeming quality I think we could have is that, as you were alluding to earlier regarding liveries and how boring they're becoming, because the Saubers of old, the first couple of Saubers were all black, and we could have maybe the Kick livery where it's that really fluorescent neon green. That'd be something. That's the only redeeming quality about this entire arrangement. But it would make them stand out much more than they did this year. My goodness. All the other teams in the bottom four, yeah, the three of them had some kind of characterful moment or something that made you remember, oh yeah, they're there. Because you'd get Haas's qualifying in Q3 and go like, oh, good for them, well done. But then suddenly they just fall down again. You think, oh, classic Haas. Whereas with Alfa Romeo, they were just like, what? Sorry, are they competing? Sorry, what? You just felt like, what on earth is Andreas Stella doing? Because the moment he arrived at McLaren in 2019, things started moving, and you were thinking, okay, they've gotten themselves sorted out. And by the end of the season, they got their first podium in years. Whereas you feel like, well, what's Stella doing here? I don't really sense anything going on. They just seem to be unambitious. They're coasting, and this is even more anonymous than they were at the end of 2022 because they started off the new regulation changes really well. Like, they were consistently scoring points with Bottas, and Zhou looked fairly competent. Like, not setting the world alight, but all right, decent. This year, though, they've just been nowhere. Like, no real sign of just kicking on and stepping up from where they used to be. And yeah, sure, they scored more points than Haas, but not by much, honestly. But you just feel like it's just a team where Bottas has just gone to retire slowly. Like, I'm glad that Valtteri has found a place where he can be the team leader and he can be happy. He seems the happiest he's been in years, and that's good for him. But it doesn't really seem like he's got the car to be able to represent that. And the moments when they do get into Q3 and you feel like, yes, they're going to get some points here, they just fall away. Either down to bad strategy calls or, as we saw in Hungary, a case of Zhou after he learnt a little bit too much from Valtteri about how to handle starts in Hungary. You just felt like the entire team was just lacking motivation and they're just coasting. They're just picking up the checks from Alfa Romeo for the naming rights and then just holding and waiting until they figure out what Audi is doing. And this whole naming structure, I feel like, Stake F1 team, I feel this is a backup plan, just in case Audi finally decides to go, you know what, we're not going to do this. We're backing out. And because if you imagine if they did and Audi would take all of their money with them and their investments, Sauber would be probably screwed and they would need investment fast. So I feel like this stake venture is something just as contingency. So it just keeps them afloat for 2 years and they can just try and do something. Because that's the thing with Alpha. Because with Haas, you just kind of give up. But with Alpha, my summation of this is like, do something! Do something to make the most of your drivers. Because as I was alluding to again earlier, Hulkenberg, he was alluded to be moving to Sauber for 2024 because they loved him when he was there for 2013. He carried that team, and then he got poached by Force India, and he just felt like they wanted Nico for his qualifying skills because, you know, it set the team alight. A Bottas Hulkenberg lineup, that's impressive. But then that fell through because, you know, Haas took up the option. So you then heard about Pourchaire being very close to getting the seat, but then he was denied it because they needed money. And Zhou Guanyu has money because he has the Chinese sponsorship, which I believe at one point was about $35 million. So I'm not calling Zhou he does come with a lot of money, and Zhou isn't terrible, but you just feel like they are settling for this lineup because there have been a lot of senior Sauber mechanics saying Zhou has to make no mistakes. He has to be good this year. And you feel like they ideally didn't want Zhou for a third season, but they're sort of making do because right now, Alpha and Sauber, they just need to kind of just tread water, just kind of keep it straight and true because I just don't really understand where they can really develop. And as we think, do they know what they're doing? I think they do, but I don't think they have the implementations and the tools in which to do it yet. They're waiting probably to find out what Audi is doing because Audi's putting zero representation on their car at all. No logos, no extra investment, no personnel. It's just very, very hands-off. They have a stake in the team, but it's just, that's it. That's all they got. And you do feel like they've only got Sauber. They're not really embracing that identity one last time. They're just kind of making do until Big Daddy Audi comes in.
Yeah, it feels as if their kind of anonymity has fallen back so far. I mean, this is a huge pull, but I'm looking at kind of my shelf of books across from here, and I've got all these preview guides from years gone past. And I'll always remember, I grew up with a copy of the 2000 preview guide, so I remember so much about all the drivers and the previews and everything in there. And in there, Sauber gets kind of lambasted a bit because they kind of say, well, what are Sauber actually doing here? You know, they're never fast enough to kind of challenge at the front, be doing anything exciting, but they're never slow enough to be featured on TV, getting lapped by everyone else. And it feels like we're 23 years down the line and we're still having that same conversation 90% of the time at the end of a season, bar the BMW years, or, you know, they had a couple of boosts up the grid. I think particularly that year when they had Nasser and Ericsson as well, and they got that big kind of haul of points in Australia the first time around with that beautiful kind of bright blue and yellow livery as well. It was a bit more exciting. But now, like you say, Law, you're just always kind of screaming, saying do something, anything, just to make it a bit more exciting or interesting.
In relation to your point, 2016 was probably their worst season, because if Felipe Nasr did not get that 9th place, Manor would have beaten them. Manor. Esteban Ocon's 10th place would have been enough to get them that constructorship money, and probably might have saved the team. Yeah, that's the telling part, because apparently their 2017 car looked fairly decent, and we might have seen Esteban Ocon still at Manor, and the story might have been completely different. We might still have 11 teams. But there, Sauber were really close to being dead last with no points. And I think that's never happened before. But it was very close. And Felipe Nasr coming in clutch once more. I think they in 2001, I'd say that's their best independent season, when they had Heidfeld and Kimi. I still find it so surreal that for the first few races, Kimi was under supervision from the FIA. They were like, you have got a conditional super license. You better not muck things up. Don't pull a Yuji Ide before Yuji Ide was a thing. And Kimi was just, okay, I'm just going to drive the car now. And oh look, I get 6th place almost immediately. That's great. Okay, can you go away now? and then lo and behold, Kimi then gets the contract to McLaren the following year, and you just feel like people don't remember that. I think whenever I tell people, he was under supervision, Kimi Räikkönen, and then Sauber they got 4th place in the constructors, and I think they did fairly decently when they had Heidfeld and Massa as well. I'd say Nick Heidfeld has probably been one of the most consistent drivers, because, yeah, sure, they occasionally, back in the days when they had Herbert and a Lacey, they get a couple of podiums every now and again, but you just feel like, oh, if only BMW stayed around. I feel like that team might have been consistently good, because they got as high as 2nd place in the championship, constructors-wise, at 2007, I believe, when they had Heidfeld and Kubica. So if only BMW hadn't pulled out, that team probably would have still been pretty good, because BMW were producing... 2009, they were fairly decent, considering that they were one of the teams that didn't have the double diffuser situation. They just didn't have that outside investment, which gives me hope with Audi, that if they can just do the same thing with BMW and not run away at the first sign of trouble, they might be able to kick up again. But these 2 seasons, I feel like they're just coasting. And I feel like Audi might exert more influence when the regulations change in 2025, when you can start developing the 2026 car again. They might start to go, we want a German in this car, ready for the first season, and get them embedded. That's why I think they'll go for Nico for 2025, because, well, he's the only German driver, and I feel like Mick Schumacher's destiny is going to be elsewhere. It'll probably be at another team. But I certainly feel like it's going to be Hülkenberg in there. I feel like Bottas probably might retire at the end of the year. I feel like he's done. I feel like he's just done enough. He probably might just want to go into doing other ventures or something. Maybe take up cycling with his partner. Or just be happy. Yeah, he's got 10 wins. He's got 10 wins in his career, which is really impressive. And just be happy. And don't feel like you have to be in F1 just for the sake of it. But yeah, if he stays, that's fine. But Hülkenberg is definitely part of that lineup. And I feel like Zhou, his time isn't really long for this. But you feel like 2024 and this year, just anonymity at its finest.
What I want to know, because the name is so awful, you can't really make heads or tails of it. Are they now called Stake, or are they Sauber? And if they, does this count as Does it count as a new constructor from next year? Because for me, and I've done this for my like stats videos, I've considered BMW Sauber and Alfa Romeo as separate constructors, or this Alfa Romeo as the same Alfa Romeo that we had in the 50s and then again in the 80s. And then people ask me, well, how come you've separated Lotus into 3 different Team Lotuses? And it's all very complex. But this is like, are they now? Do they just go back to being Sauber, which they were in 2018, or are they now Stake or Kick? It's
Well,
just I don't know who came up with that name, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's technically slightly different now because the actual chassis is called a Kick Sauber.
Yeah.
As opposed to just a Sauber. So
I didn't think you could buy naming rights for cars.
I'd never seen. No, it's
because like it could have been a thing where the constructor is Sauber, but the team is called Stake, because obviously that used to happen all the time. You know, you had like Scuderia Italia, their cars were built by Lola and Dallara, as an example. It's just like, what I just look at them thinking, what is wrong with just calling yourself Sauber? Because that's what everyone always calls you, and that's because you've always been, Team Hinwil, if you want to call them that. Just always the Swiss team, just middling it in the midfield for 30 years. Because when you think about it, aside from the BMW years, they have been just in the middle, and it's like you think after the 30-year arc, you would have made some gain somewhere, because every other team that's lasted that long has had points where they've been running at the front, and then they've ebbs and flows. And they, aside from BMW, haven't really had that. And it's like you'd think by now they would have made some more progress. But I've liked the fact that it's given continuity and they've at least been present. Like, they haven't been invisible, but I compare how they are now to how they were 10 years ago, or a little over 10 years ago, when they had Kobayashi and Checo, how much more exciting that was. Such a good lineup, and they would have races where if they weren't fighting at the front, they were at least being interesting because they were making moves and doing stuff like that, and that just doesn't happen anymore. And this year they've been so invisible, and it was the same most of last year as well. I mean, there's like Joe's only standout moment last year was almost getting killed at Silverstone. And Bottas has never been an exciting driver, but this has just magnified it or amplified it even more. That he just doesn't, he's just not running around, not passing anyone, mostly just getting past, rarely if ever fighting for points. And it's just so, it's like Haas. It's just so uninteresting, and it's like, what's the point of being here when you're not even going to look like you're going to fight for points unless there's some big crash further ahead and you get them by default.
I think they might have to be called Sauber, because I saw a tweet from Andrew Benson, who works for the BBC, and he brought up a really good point, is that the BBC cannot be promoting gambling websites. So Stake is crypto gambling, and Kick is its offshoot in terms of streaming. So I get the feeling that journalists probably will be contractually and legally obliged to not call them Stake F1 team. They would have to call them Sauber, because that's something that journalists will have to consider. And I think probably most TV channels, I imagine probably the likes of Crofty, the Sky Sports, and many of the journalists and all the teams will probably just call them Sauber, just for the sake it's the least complicated name for them.
Well, it's probably the only reason that Sauber name's still there, really, isn't it? It did seem like a bit of an addendum, and I suppose if they can't go around just calling it the Stake F1 team or anything like that, they kind of have to add on that addendum, which, yeah, is a horrible way to do it, really, because when BMW took over, I think Sauber just assumed they were going to disappear, and BMW went, no, we're going to call it BMW Sauber in respect to kind of this groundwork that you've built up, and that we're going to kind of develop forward a bit more. And I know that meant quite a lot to Peter Sauber for that to still be kind of included within that way. But yeah, this way it's the kind of a mere afterthought and kind of pushed under the rug in a way.
Yeah, that's really, really sad. And another team that's going around for a specific name change, but it's been relatively vague at the moment based on the entry list, is, well, we're just going to call them AlphaTauri right now, because realistically, they are a team that are going through a bit of a transition, no longer being seen as the sister team or the junior team. I believe now the what they're trying to be is a customer team, which isn't great if you're a junior driver, but the Red Bull second team has seen its fair share of interesting drivers, and Now, let's remember here, for the vast majority of the season, AlphaTauri were the slowest, and they were lucky to even score. Yuki Tsunoda this year carried the team throughout the entire first half. He'd be getting loads of P11 finishes, just nearly missing out on the points, and then when he does score points, it would always be P10, but he'd be giving that team some sense of hope, and that there can be at least some sort of salvation in terms of scoring, and they're not going to get a duck. So I feel like Tsunoda has kicked on and has improved. And he's dealt with a lot of drivers this season and a lot of people who could easily topple him from his seat. First off, we had Nick de Vries. I'm not going to say that Nick de Vries was a terrible driver. He was not, because I don't think Toyota would have picked him up for their WEC campaign. So he does have talent there, and he has won Formula E championships. It's just I feel like his situation was not suited to the Red Bull camp, and that's what I found really weird. Nick's a Mercedes-backed driver. Why on earth would he be there? That just wouldn't work. This felt like a moment of Helmut Marko being somewhat of a magpie and going, "Oh, Italian shiny thing, I want that guy. You sure? Yeah, I want him. I want him." And then, okay, so he didn't have any junior drivers good at the time. So Nick de Vries, I felt like if only he got a whole season, I think he would have improved, because Yuki was saying that he got a lot of good insight from Nick de Vries' feedback, and he wasn't unpopular with the mechanics and the crew, Nick. They liked him. They respected him. But it's just the fact is, though, he wasn't getting results, and Helmut and Christian just were looking for an excuse to get rid of him. Daniel was doing well in the tire test, and they just told him, "Yeah, you're out, Daniel's in." And that was just extremely unfortunate and really unfair. Because we're not saying that Nick de Vries was like Mazepin levels of bad or terrible or awful. He was just not as good as people expected. But I think if he had been able to drive the car that had more of his feedback, which we started to see in the second half of the season, with more parts from the RB19, with that rear suspension, he might have done better. But it's nice to hear that Yuki's getting a lot more, got a lot out of his partnership with Nick, and that he does thank him for a lot of his feedback. And maybe that's been why Yuki's been able to hold his own against the likes of Liam Lawson when he came in, and Daniel Ricciardo. Because the whole situation is that Yuki has been, in terms of qualifying, faster than all of them, basically. And just being able to hold his own. Yes, the Yuki of old has been around and is still, he still makes mistakes and he still has tantrums, but they're far less, because he's had to grow up a lot this season, dealing with 3 different teammates that have been opposing, trying to be thinking, oh, is this going to be the combination of drivers that's going to see Yuki leave? No, he's seen another season. And the AlphaTauri team finally did find the means to sort themselves out and get that placed in Mexico, which got them up from P10 to P8. And just like what Yuki did in Abu Dhabi this year was amazing and remarkable, and how at one point he was leading the race, that accident he had with Piastri in Mexico, that probably also may have costed them 7th place. But at the same time, he did try and make amends for it with that bold strategy in Abu Dhabi. So swings and roundabouts there, really. So it's just a very tumultuous team, but you feel happy for them that they were able to sort things out, even though they've had to go back to the old Toro Rosso model of basically borrowing all the hand-me-downs from the top team.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take too much away from what he did, because obviously it was very good, and I said this all. I was saying this all, that he'd really kind of matured and assumed the role of team leader, but was just fighting in a car that couldn't do any better than 10th, no matter how hard he pushed it. I think he was helped by the fact that it was such a not free for all, but there was so much change in the second seat, because De Vries was. I think they should have at least let him go until the summer break, just to give, even though he was really not very good until then. Ricciardo, comes back, has a year out, but then he breaks his hand, so he never really gets going. And then Lawson's a rookie, so that definitely helped. But even so, when they stepped up, he did as well. So it wasn't like Ricciardo and Lawson suddenly just walked all over him. He still kept close to them. And they brought in their upgrades. I think it was at Singapore. They brought their big upgrade package, which basically was like, we're copying Red Bull. Not that we, don't copy them already, would you believe? And they did gain a lot of points in the final half of the season, which did give them 8th or 7th or whatever it was, 8th in the constructors. But yeah, I see a lot of people being very divided about who they should have actually chosen for next year. And it's like, well, for me, I wanted Tsunoda and Lawson. Like Ricardo, I think we just don't. It's like Kvyat. Like, we just don't need him anymore. He can go and do something else or launch his own Netflix show. I don't know. I just can't be bothered with him. But like Lawson has done, he will get a seat at some point in the future. Maybe probably 25. They'll throw him in. Or when they lose their Honda engines, that's probably when Tsunoda's done. Because I think that it seems to be the curse of the Japanese driver. You're there at the mercy of either Honda, Toyota, or Yamaha. You don't really get Japanese drivers getting in just because they can. It's usually because they've got backing from one of the engines. But yeah, we'll see how they do next year. But it was a bit up and down. And obviously, they're never a team that you expect to really be amazing, and that's not their job, because they're supposed to be the junior team, if not on paper anymore, to Red Bull, except for in 2008 when they beat them, which was probably quite embarrassing. But yeah, I think it should really have been Lawson again, because it's meant to be a junior team, so it should have been the young ones. So yeah, Lawson and Tsunoda next year, it should have been.
Yeah, but I feel like based on what Peter Bayer, the new CEO of the AlphaTauri team, they're basically saying now that instead of what he said originally, that they're going to commit to the junior driver model, that they're saying, oh, we're going to try. Yeah, we'll try and fulfill it. And it just feels like they're less and less thinking about that model of bringing up the juniors, and that it'll be just one of the things that they might try and abide by. So that's something a little bit of a concerning. If I were a Red Bull junior driver, I'd be really worried right now that you probably might not get a seat, or you might get one in 3 years or something like that. But I feel like Yuki has done enough to be able to make the fight for the second Red Bull seat, because it's quite obvious that Checo is not going to be there. He'll see out his contract, but I think he'll probably be done with the entire situation anyway. It's a straight up contest, I think, between Tsunoda and Ricciardo, between those two. And I feel like, thanks to what Yuki's been able to do and not allow Daniel just to run away with it, it's made people go like, hang on a minute, Yuki getting that seat next to Max, it's not an impossibility anymore. It's an improbability. But probability is better than it being impossible. There's a chance. And I'm quite excited to see these two go head to head over an entire season, to see what they can do. Because that team combination is fairly solid. And if Daniel can figure out his situation, that seat's his to lose at Red Bull. That's his to lose. Yuki, I don't think he has anything to lose, as you say, because eventually, as Ford starts to, show its influence and relationship with Red Bull, and then Honda starts to phase itself out and move toward Aston Martin, then that could be something that we might see. If Yuki does lose out, maybe the collaboration with the likes of Honda might see him getting a place as the reserve or the lead driver at Aston Martin if Lance Stroll gets pushed out to the World Endurance situation. Don't know. There's a lot of unknowns there, but you feel like I'm quite curious to see what this team does next year, just in the sense that Yuki is fired up, and I feel like Daniel, he's got a bit of a challenge on his hands. This isn't going to be a cakewalk for him for that second seat anymore, even though Christian Horner so wants it to happen, because Daniel was the driver that got away. I'm pretty sure that Christian was kicking himself that he allowed that to happen. And then now he's got him back. And now Christian's all smug and happy again, because he's managed to get that team, the dream team of 2018, back together. Well, hopefully. It's just as long as Yuki can actually bring up the goods. But I feel like AlphaTauri, I mean, naturally, they will be better next year because they will have more parts. And it's very interesting because the FIA, Nicholas Tombas, has been going on record saying, yeah, we are aware about what they've said. And just so you know, we will make inspections. And now they're coming out saying, we plan to do more zero tolerance stuff and just turning up unannounced. We would ideally like to just say, call the team and go, hey, we're about to come to your premises. When are you coming? Right now. And then just try and catch people out. But then they also say, well, we can't monitor things on the daily. So you just feel like this is a little bit of a warning shot to Red Bull, going like, "Hey, don't you copy too much." So it'll be interesting to see how close that renovated RB19 from another mother turns out to work with Sonoda and Daniel.
There's so much narrative around AlphaTauri, particularly this year as well. There wasn't really a case of, whereas we've seen with the previous kind of two teams we've discussed, with a Magnussen or a Bottas or something, that would have been kind of anonymous and we can swiftly move on and talk about other bits and pieces. I think within each of these kind of four drivers, there's interesting things for us to kind of pick at and discuss. I mean, touching on Nick De Vries, I think the main kind of question we're going to have around him this year was that firing justified? Should it have been a little later on? Should he have been given out the whole kind of season? The interesting thing for me is it opens up this discussion about how we should be judging these kind of rookie drivers nowadays, because the prospect of being a rookie in F1 nowadays is wildly changed over time, and now they're getting so little kind of seat time before they head to that season opener that some people will kind of discuss their whole first season as more kind of like a prolonged testing session for them to get used to the car and the rigors of racing and qualifying and all these other sorts of bits and pieces. So we get into this interesting discussion, and we'll touch on it in a little bit as well when we maybe talk about Logan Sargent as well, of what's the best kind of model from which we should be judging these people. Do we judge it from a Nick De Vries perspective where it's sink or swim, and if you're not immediately swimming, you get in the boot? Or do we judge it from that Logan Sargent perspective of give them time, nurture them, support them, and move them forwards? Certainly Nick De Vries will be a big component and a big protagonist for kind of that latter option. It's very easy to miss within kind of all the talk that he was hotly tipped to go to Williams for this year. As a Williams supporter, I was a big champion of that. I was impressed by what he'd done in Italy, and again, we can kind of discuss how impressive that actually was in retrospect, but he'd seemed solid enough, and likewise with his practice appearances as well. If he had been the one who'd taken that Williams seat and taken up that offer, there's every chance we would still be discussing about him now and his prospects moving forward, because presumably he would have had that same kind of nurture that James Vowles imparted onto Logan Sargent. The tricky part of it is because we had Liam Lawson coming in this year, quite unexpected as well, and was immediately impressive. There was no real time for him to kind of bed in, but straight away from the off, he'd had pretty much no time in the car. But as soon as he kind of jumped in at Zandvoort, he was kind of immediately impressing, and it was kind of a sense of, well, why hadn't De Vries been doing that at all? I know it's easier to say when you're midway through a season and your car is getting more and more competitive, but it was just kind of frustrating. So when you see the performances of the likes of a Lawson or a Piastri, who are able to kind of impress within these rookie seasons, compared to a De Vries or a Sargent who really kind of struggled, we then kind of have to enter that debate of what's the fairest and best way of doing it. And I think that the biggest answer we're going to get out of that is going to be in 2024, when we see what Sargent does in that Williams and how he performs compared to Albon and what kind of results he's able to produce. Is that a sign that, yes, we need to be giving these rookie drivers more time to bed in and let them grow? It's going to be a big litmus test for a lot of the grid, because if he does struggle, that's going to be a sign for a lot of other teams to say, well, look, this other team, they gave this guy who struggled another chance. It didn't work out. So do we need to follow the same model? Should we just follow that Red Bull model of sink or swim as well? Lawson absolutely should be with that team next year. I guess in the minority, I strongly thought that it was going to be a Ricciardo Lawson lineup for them next year. And Yuki getting booted, not because he's been bad, far from it. I think this has been his best year, and he's been one of the drivers of the year for me in terms of the way he's been able to, particularly in that first part of the year, kind of drag that AlphaTauri kicking and screaming towards the front. But like Law said, we should be having a discussion about whether he should be taking over that Perez seat at Red Bull. The worrying thing is that no one else is having that discussion. You see in the media that they talk up that they want Daniel back there. Liam has been talked up there. There's been more recent discussions that if they poach someone from somewhere else, like a Lando Norris or a Carlos Sainz, rarely, if any time at all, is being given to discussing whether Yuki should be there or not. So for me, it raised that question of, if they're not genuinely considering for a seat, why is he within this outfit whose role it is to kind of nurture and decide and assess, these are the drivers we want moving forward. So let's keep them there, see how they're performing, and then move one up and move one down. I wonder maybe whether there were behind the scenes discussions about whether they could have moved Yuki on to somewhere else that we've not been privy to. And that kind of would have neatly solved a lot of their problems of, I don't know, the Yuki situation almost kind of reminds me of when they brought Pierre Gasly back to that same outfit, and it was kind of a case of, we this guy's really talented and we want to keep hold of him, but also we don't want to bring him up to the main outfit, so we're just kind of placehold him here and let him kind of circulate around and then decide what to do later on before they inevitably kind of jump ship.
Yeah, now with the Pierre situation, it just seemed really frustrating because obviously, according to various outlets, they were saying that he was quite good at rubbing people up the wrong way at the Red Bull team. Like, he was quite aggressive and not very... He didn't get on with them as well. And when he got booted back down, he was just then told to kind of learn things. But he proved himself so mightily in 2020 when he got that win. Much like with Sebastian Vettel at the same track in 2008. You felt like, well, surely Pierre is justified and to get back up there and have another go. But then Checo came in because it was a feel-good story. Because Checo was about to be booted out for Vettel in the new Aston Martin team. So Red Bull, Christian goes like, we're going to be the good guys here. We're going to give Checo a lifeline and bring him back to us. And then that was a feel-good, good PR move for Red Bull, who are known to flirt with the likes of bad publicity or being seen as rogues. So this was obviously a feel-good story. But with Gasly, you just felt like... And this is why he left for Alpine. He just got bored because he wasn't going anywhere. It was quite clear that he was never going to get it back up to the top team because either Helmut Marko wouldn't allow it or he would just feel like the team around him, he was a team leader there. So there were a lot of factors keeping him there. So he just felt like, you know what? I think I've just got to forge my own destiny here and go somewhere else. And I feel like Yuki needs to have an exit strategy ready, just in case Red Bull suddenly go like, you know what? You're good, Yuki, but since we're breaking up with Honda now, we haven't got any room for you, mate. So I feel like he needs to have a backup plan just in case. Because I think he's good enough to be in F1. He's definitely worthy of having a seat for at least a few more years. And he's good publicity for Japan because he is a really good driver. And he is quite tenacious. He has personality, he has character. So he's good for the world of Formula One. So it would be ideal if he could jump over to Aston Martin, if Honda had that much sway, and be able to try and convince Papa Stroll to bring Yuki over to partner Fernando, or if Fernando decides to retire, partner up with Lance, see what happens there. But definitely feels like something is brewing there. And there is going to be an interesting battle and what we could really expect for the future of that team. Much like how we can expect the future of the team regarding Williams, because as we were talking about earlier, the situation with that team is this is the feel-good story of the year. Williams, 12 months ago, looked like a team that had no direction whatsoever. Like, you felt completely hopeless. Like, there's no goal here. There's no aim. Nicholas Latifi was only kept on for 2022 because that was an act of goodwill, because they kept saying, well, thanks to the investment from Dorilton, we don't really need your money anymore, Nicky. So considering how well you've been doing for us, and we probably really don't have any good substitution, yeah, stay. Just stay one more year. And it was clear that Latifi was struggling with the new types of car and probably all the fallout from 2021 probably affecting his mental health. So it was just clear that he was just not destined to be in F1 anymore. So then they had to bring in Logan Sargent for 2023, a year earlier than the plan. And James Vowles has come out and said, yeah, we rushed in Logan way too soon, and that's on us. We are going to honor that situation and give him that extra year. And you felt like, this is a really good turnaround. You feel like Williams is the opposite of Haas in the sense that Haas are pretty much the badniks of F1, as in, like, they just don't know what they're doing. Whereas Williams now have become the paragon. Like, they have become the loyal, the honourable, the organised team that they were not at all. Because a few years ago, it was quite obvious that Williams had a lot of cliques and a lot of internal rumblings and drama and you just felt like it was very, very divided. And they also kept trying to make everything themselves in house. They have started to divest themselves of that, and now you feel like Williams, they're the most together that I've seen since 2017. Like in terms of they seem to have things figured out. They've got a huge major sponsor in golf. Yeah, that's a big deal, and that's a very major get. Their partnership with Mercedes, it's turned out that, sure, they could be described as the B team, but James Vowles, who I thought was going to be just a puppet for Toto, even though Toto used to be the executive director for Williams, and he used to be a somewhat decent-sized shareholder, that you just thought with all of those rumors going around that Toto went to James and said, oh, by the way, James, I have data that you would like to have the data about Mick Schumacher. Let's just get Mick back in the car so he can be in Formula One. Look at the data. And then James looked at the data and was like, no, thanks. I like Logan. And you feel like, very good, James. Very good. You are not just a yes man. You are actually taking this seriously. And I couldn't be any more proud for him and the team. This is the story that we all needed to have. This team managed to drag that car, which has been known just to be a straight line demon, and get P7. But we cannot ignore Alex Albon here, because that's the turnaround that everybody had. Because with Pierre, he had the opportunity to go back to the junior team and try his luck there and then make that team for himself. Albon didn't get that because Yuki was coming in the collaboration with Honda to partner up with Pierre. So Alex didn't have that luxury. He was cast to the reserve role and doing stuff for DTM, ironically with Ferrari, which is really odd, with a Ferrari car. But you just felt really sorry for Alex. So this role, when he got that on-loan deal with Williams, and then Toto kicked up a stink and say, oh no, we can't have a Red Bull driver driving a Mercedes-powered car. We have to isolate him from various meetings and stuff. But luckily they worked that out. And then as soon as that happened, Toto would say, oh, well, of course, Alex Albon should be in Formula One. He is definitely a good driver. And I didn't mean it like that. No, you totally meant it like that, Toto. Don't be like that. But you just felt like Alex, yes, he's found a team where he can be the leader. His nice guy attitude is respected, and it's flattered by the Williams team as of now. And I've never really seen a bad story regarding Williams all season. And you feel like there are so many good things about that team coming forward. But the problem is, though, is that in this era of ground effect, and this is something that's probably going to keep them from going any higher up the grid, they cannot rely on straight line speed anymore. This is the ground effect era. You need that underfloor downforce more than ever. And Williams don't have that. They have a car which is infamously difficult to drive. Alex said so himself. And he's been defending Logan because Logan has been the top of the Destructors Championship. But Alex has not been that far behind because Williams, an estimated $7 million worth of damage. So it's on the team to make a car which is less mistake prone, a bit more forgiving. And it can actually deal with the corners a little better. And I feel like that will easily improve the situation with Logan, because I felt like it was the right decision for them to keep Logan, because I feel like they honored their commitment. They admitted that they brought him in a year too early, and it's quite right. You need 2 seasons to be able to show what they can do. But of course, if Logan doesn't perform and he doesn't kick on, then sure, Williams have every right to replace him. But the question is, though, with who? Because it really depends on whether that connection with Mercedes is still that close. Because if Kimi Antonelli, a Mercedes driver, gets in the top 3 in his rookie year, you guarantee that Toto will be very insistent that that guy gets into Formula One with Williams. But if that doesn't happen, then what about with Colapinto, O'Sullivan? They're other Williams Academy drivers. They'll have only been in F2 for 1 year. Would they make the same mistake again? So I wouldn't be surprised if Logan maybe gets a 3rd season. I wouldn't be surprised. Could happen, especially if he does get some more points finishes, because that's what Williams needs. If they really want to get above P7 and maybe give Alpine a fright, basically, they need both drivers on it.
Williams is interesting because in terms of their like average pace, it's kind of basically the same as Alfa Romeo and Haas, but then they do have these breakout modes because they're basically straight line merchants because of the Mercedes engines. I mean, I've said this before that Williams in the hybrid era is basically Mercedes but shit, and You feel like there's potential to improve and get better is the thing. And I'm really enjoying James Fowles' leadership because he's the complete opposite of someone like Helmut Marko when it comes to driver management. He's very honest, very congenial. He's always being like, yes, we know that Logan is struggling, and yes, his crashing, it is costing us a lot of money that we want to put on development, but we don't think it's good to just beat him down and make it any worse than it already is. We need to keep his spirits high and not ruin his mental health or anything like that. And you feel like that's rather than just throwing him out after a year. It's like maybe now there is a chance to see what he could do, because I didn't know originally that they were putting him in a year earlier than planned. But obviously things really completely went off the rails with Latifi. He is lucky though as well that the rest of their junior drivers are just not ready, because Colapinto and O'Sullivan are only just going into Formula 2. And even after 1 year, unless it's a really, really good year for either of them, or if one of them wins the title, they're not going to be ready. So that has definitely helped him. Although we're in this kind of phase at the moment where teams seem determined to take drivers that aren't from their academies. This is becoming a very trendy thing, because we see Red Bull talking about taking in Lando, and obviously De Vries was Mercedes and he goes to AlphaTauri and all of that. So it wouldn't surprise me if they just grab someone from somewhere else. But yeah, you feel like they've picked themselves up after losing the Williams family and having this new identity with Dorilton Capital. Although they've kept the same name and they've kept that same legacy. But yeah, I think James is in a good place. And as you said, yeah, he's not a yes man, and he doesn't want to he doesn't just want to be a Mercedes B team, and he kind of wants to give Williams their own identity, because you forget that they used to be like the team to beat 30 years ago. They were the ones at the top, and then even 20 years ago they were near the top, and they had those amazing kind of BMW cars. And so yeah, I just kind of want to see them get back to that point.
Yeah, we didn't come last is the best news. I'm trying so hard not to be so excited about it, because I've been a Williams fan since 2006. So I have seen a lot more lows than I have any kind of highs. There are so many seasons where I've had very little to kind of cheer about and been resigned to, especially in more recent years as well, being mired in that kind of back position, as particularly that year with Russell and Kubica as well, which was just such a slog in a way, because they were just the worst, and that's just how it was, and there wasn't anything to do about it. To see Williams kind of slowly claw them way back up the midfield has been such a feel-good thing for me. I mean, it's difficult, and me and Peter discussed this the other day, to establish whether this is an overachievement or an underachievement for this year for Williams. Because of the disparity between the two drivers, it's very hard to tell whether Logan wasn't performing at the maximum he should have, or whether Alex was going above that, or whether this was actually less than what the Williams could do. It's very hard to say. I mean, the facts are that it's P7 in the championship, which is the best it's been for many, many years. And it's not just been just that one-off kind of thing. There's been a lot more consistency about Williams this year, which I think is the key. You had so many occasions in the past few years where they would have one or two good races because they had geared their car going towards a particular circuit. So we're going to kind of maximize it there and then just be content to tootle around in 15th, 16th for the rest of the races. Here, this year, we saw a much more consistent Williams where it would turn up to repeated venues and look more like a competitive package. We had the longest streak of kind of Williams point scores for the first time, I think, since 2016, 2017. Likewise, very strong qualifying performances as well, the highest that a Williams has been, again, probably just about as long as well. So, yeah, fantastic for me. I mean, it's hard to know where to go from here, really. I think there's a very good infrastructure in place, and clearly James Fowles is very good at what he does. He comes across very well on camera every time he talks. If anyone is not a Williams fan, I highly implore you to kind of follow Williams on social media, because James Fowles does a debrief after every race, and he's very eloquent at what he does. He speaks very well in explaining why things happened the way they did, and understanding, the inner workings of a race weekend, which is always interesting to hear. It's interesting to compare sort of how he compared to like a Jos Capito, who was quite a big signing for a team like Williams that I was happy with. My understanding is that, I don't know whether this is still the case, but certainly when Capito was there, Williams was still very kind of rigid in the way that the team was structured and the way things that were run there. You know, it was very much, this is the Williams way and this is the way things need to be. And I think the way Capito fell down was he pushed too hard against that in a way and said, in fairness, you know, the Williams way may well have worked 30, 20 years ago, but nowadays it is moving you further and further down the field. We need to kind of mix things up, change things around a bit. And I think there was a bit of grating there, whereas Vowles, I think, understands that, but also is gentle enough and passionate enough that he can kind of implement some of his own changes and move things forward. They've got a decent kind of driver partnership established there. There's the partnership with Mercedes. There's the money coming in from Gulf as well, which is all really positive. Working out where to go from here is difficult. I think we'll only really know whether it's kind of paying off if Williams are performing at the same kind of level next year. I'm not optimistic enough to, again, having seen so many peaks and dips from Williams across the years, that just because they finished 7th this year does not mean that it's just going to rocket back down to the bottom again next year. One video I've always wanted to make and I've never quite been able to kind of cobble it together is understanding what way back for Williams, because there are so many instances of history of so many of these other iconic constructors like your Lotuses, your Brabhams, your Tyrrells, these amazing names who were right at the front of the grid and then slowly slid back down and then disappeared entirely. And whether there is a way for Williams to kind of avoid that fate as well, because it seemed like it's been going that way for so long as well. Whether they need to get some sort of other manufacturer, you know, supporting or something like that, that would be a logical step if they do want to move and have ambitions to move back forward to the front. But without that, it's whether they can get up to, you know, like a McLaren operating level where they are a customer team, but they can still utilize their infrastructure and move forward enough.
Yeah, well, getting back to where they used to be, it's all in the staff, really. And obviously, the way, if we go, 20, 30 years, well, Frank Williams, he's now dead. Patrick Head, he was a consultant until a few years ago, but he's gone. And obviously, Adrian Newey, well, it's been nearly 30 years since Adrian Newey left, but he's at Red Bull. It's just getting the right staff in. And I think James Vowles, that's a very good starting point, because I love the Vowles verdicts, and I love how just honest he is, particularly after, was it Monaco or Spain, where they were lifted up on the crane and you could see the underside of the car, and then there was just nothing going on. It was very basic. It looked like the 80s ground effect cars. It was just a tube running under the car, basically. And he was like, yeah, we don't have the money to do any better, and this is just how it is. And I think also because he's like, well, obviously, we got the slowest car. Nobody's copying us. So we may as well just spill the tea and say everything that's going on with it. It's good to see that level of honesty, because obviously Red Bull are never going to, well, obviously they were forced to, because again, Monaco, everyone got to see the underside of their car, and Mercedes the same. They're not going to spill their secrets if they don't have to. So yeah, the good team leader, obviously design team is kind of, it's there or thereabouts. I mean, the if you want to describe it in gaming terms, the meta is not really on their side so much. Because I suppose 09 to 013, I'd call that like a diffuser meta. 014 to 21, that can be the engine meta, where obviously they had the Mercedes ones, and now we're in the floor meta, I guess I'd call it. And so that's where, they really need to work on the aero, because the straight line is good, but obviously most circuits, straight line speed doesn't matter so much. Although, having said that, I have no idea how they did so well at Zandvoort.
Yeah, that was completely bizarre.
Yeah, because
I don't think even they understood that either.
That's not a circuit that's meant to suit them. Obviously, the result in the end, I mean, because Logan Sargent crashed his way into Q3, and then they ruined his race within 3 laps by pitting him way too late, and then he crashes, although the crash wasn't his fault because it was a suspension failure or something. So that was a train wreck. That was the thing that annoyed me, is that they do like to put bad strategies in that would often wreck things, and we saw this again in Vegas, because that's a circuit that suits them perfectly. First stint, they were running 6th and 7th. I was like, this is really good. Logan is better because he's actually sticking with Albon and he's close to him. And then they try to go for a 1-stop, which is my least favorite strategy. And then they just disappear in the final stint. It's like, for once, can someone just do a 4-stop? Just once. Just see if you can do a whole race of doing nothing but quali laps, and maybe it's actually better than just being like, my tires all the time. Just do something different, and they're in a position where they can do something different. Because when you're at the back, you have to. So why not just try and be interesting? Just even if it doesn't end up being competitive, just at least try and be entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that Vegas race was like they should have scored. They scored none. Luckily, no one else in the bottom four scored any points. That is something they got extremely lucky that time out because that could have been the race that they lost to AlphaTauri, who were looking fairly decent. And that is definitely something they need, that strategy team up and running, because had Logan been able to stick it out, because he was pulling out a gap to 7th place. There was about like 5-second gap before the safety car came out. Um, so he was pulling out a decent gap and staying behind Albon, as you said. So you felt like if that had ring true and they would have both scored points, the narrative about Logan Sargent being good enough for Formula One would have probably been deafened considerably. Like, he would have scored a good point. He would have gotten a Q3 spot in decent capacity and then scored a decent amount of points. And I think people would have then gone, okay, he's decent. He made up for it. Let's see what he does next year. But then that didn't happen. He then fell down to the bottom and didn't score any points. But neither did Alex. And you just feel like people aren't going to recognize that about Alex. They're just going to say, oh, Logan got into Q3 and got P6 and then botched it. Oh, he's not good because he's American. And I'm like, stop. Just stop it. He's doing the best he can. And I'm glad that Williams can see that.
Yeah, it's been real kind of peaks and troughs with Sargent this year, and especially my own opinion towards him as well, I think has very much fluctuated between, yes, let's keep him on and see what he does, to no, let's get rid of this man immediately. And very rarely kind of any in between as well. I think it started positively for him, fell away a bit, and then again we enter that kind of conversation of what way are we judging rookies and their performances on track, because that was maybe the disappointing thing about Logan, is that he didn't particularly have one of those standout moments for him. I think the best it got was that Vegas race, which again, I'm in agreement with both of you. I don't understand how no points were scored that race. I didn't watch that one live, and unfortunately part of it was spoiled for me. I accidentally went to social media and I saw a post of Williams going, oh, no points today. And I was thinking, how on earth? And then I'm watching the replay and they're circulating in the top 6 for so long. And again, I'm saying, how on earth does this not translate to even just a 10th place out of it as well? It was kind of baffling in a way. But I agree with what Peter said. I think Logan is lucky that there is no other kind of ready-made replacement there for him. I think the only way they could have really justified replacing him would be for a more experienced head to come in there. It doesn't make sense really to replace him with a rookie, be that a Frederick Vesti or a Felipe Drugovich or something like that. Because then you just enter the same conversation again probably this time next year, where if one of them has struggled all year, do we just chuck that one on there and bring someone else back in again? So the only person they could have really replaced him with was someone experienced, and they didn't want Schumacher, rightly or wrongly. I think that would have been interesting to see how he would have done with a year away, a bit more time to calm down and make more of this opportunity with less crashing potentially. But for whatever reason, we're not going to see that. Val's sort of said he's seen the data from what Schumacher was putting in the Mercedes simulator, and it wasn't kind of conclusive or impressive enough for him to think, yes, this is worth booting out Logan and putting Mick in instead. So yeah, Logan is going to be really one who's interesting to keep an eye on next year and see what kind of effect it gives a rookie to have that year of support and then be provided with a second opportunity. He's going to be, if anything, probably under more pressure next year because he doesn't have anything else to hide behind anymore.
The closest comparison I suppose you can make is Latifi. And Latifi, well, the thing is, it was the rule changes that made him get worse, because in 2020, no one really expected him to beat George, but he was better than you would expect because, okay, in qualifying, nowhere near, but then at the time, George was Mr. Saturday, and George is not really Mr. Saturday anymore. But then in races, he was often a lot closer, and he made far fewer mistakes. And 2021, he actually scored points before George, which is the most George Russell thing to ever happen. But yes, so and I think that was off, aside from, I mean, the last race where, I mean, crashing, chasing down a Haas. I mean, I don't know what was going on there, to be honest. It was, that feeds the conspiracy theories. He did generally improve, but he was hurt by the rule changes. And I think, you can only really get better. And to be honest, if the car's going to be basically the same for Logan, he'll just kind of pick up where he left off. And and that. But it was a bit underwhelming because in Formula 2 he'd been good enough, sort of Jack Doohan levels of performance, like near the top but not quite at the top. But then you felt like he was owed it because he lost the Formula 3 title to Piastri by being taken out on the first lap. And then after that, everyone didn't know where he was going to go and everything. And and it's good to have an American on the grid, but at the same time, apparently he's not that well known in America because he didn't really race there. He's raced in Europe. But that's the same thing Scott Speed does, and the same for everyone. You kind of have to race in Europe if you're going to be an F1 driver, because like Pietro Fittipaldi, I mean, he was born in America, but he's Brazilian. He did a lot of racing in America, and he's sort of got into F1 eventually ish, and although now he's continuing to be Haas's reserve driver, even though he's doing IndyCar next year, so God knows how that's going to work. Yeah, but he doesn't have quite as much market value as you thought is the thing for an American. But yeah, I mean he got a point by default. Maybe we'll see if he can get a point that's not on a technicality.
Yeah, I think one thing we need to consider for all 4 teams is that they all need to kind of like figure something out in some shape or form. Haas has got to figure out their own upgrade path. Sauber just needs to figure out what direction they really want to go.
And who the hell they are.
Yeah, exactly, their own identity. Same goes for AlphaTauri to a lesser extent, but they just need to figure out what their plan is in terms of a driver lineup. And Williams need to stop relying on straight line speed all the time, because they really need to develop something that can handle the corners, which means both their drivers aren't going to really be pushing it to the limit and then making mistakes where they crash out. Because let's not forget, Albon had that big off in Australia and Monaco. So Alex has made his own fair share of gaffes, as well as Logan.
I think we've covered pretty much all we could say about these bottom 4 teams. It's a shame really that 2 of them there's very little. They were just completely uninspired, and the other 2, it's like there's potential there, but just not quite enough to break through. But yeah, they haven't had as interesting campaigns as you would for 2023 as you would expect for most backmarkers.
Yeah, I think the one positive is I think within each one there is, again, enough narrative or enough standout moments where we can pinpoint, good things did happen to every team, whether it was just a very good qualifying performance or a near miss at a podium or something like that. Everybody had something to talk back and look back and reflect on. And again, touching on what I said, it's the most competitive this kind of lower part has been in such a long time. There's such marginal differences between finishing in 7th to 10th place, which was, as the season went on, stretched out a little bit, but for a long time was very much within a couple of points or so. So this kind of little, if you want to call it a backmarker kind of tussle, was a really kind of interesting little dynamic to pay attention to this year, and what was otherwise, less interesting at the front, but towards that back and the battle for these millions between 7th and 10th was definitely one worth keeping an eye on a lot more than it has been kind of in previous years as well.
So I guess we'll just have to see. They're all in sort of transitional periods, and they seem to have rough plans laid out for what they want to do. So I guess we'll just have to see if things move around much, or for all we know, these could be the 4 front runners in 2026. Thank you to Law and to Chicane for playing the parts of Nav and Ciaron for this episode. If you want to plug yourselves, where can people find you on social media?
Thank you. The Mobile Chicane on YouTube. We just released our 10K special looking at the wretched racing of Ricardo Rosset. We do various other historical things on there. And we've also got our own alternate season review, quite different from this, doing that with Peter. So that should be coming out just a couple of days after this one airs. So keep an eye out for that one.
You can find me on most places with LawVS, or if you want to check out the audio versions of my stuff, you just search for F1 Ladderman, and you'll pretty much find me.
You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Join us for the next part of this 2023 season review, where we should look at the 4 front runners: Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, and Aston Martin. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.